3 weeks of sleepless nights, wondering if I'd ever see my husband again, only to have him walk through our door with stories that sounded even stranger than fever dreams. Giant fish, reluctant prophecy, and divine mercy. I'd prayed for his safe return, but I never imagined God's answer would involve, well, quite so much drama. I'm Eliza. I run a fabric business here in Israel, and I'm married to Jonah. Yes, that Jonah, the prophet, the one with the whale story. But nobody talks about what it's like to be married to the man who tried to run away from God. Nobody talks about the wife who had to watch it all happen. This is my side of the story. Let me tell you what it's like being married to a prophet. Do you know how hard it is to run a fabric business when your husband gets divine appointments with no advance notice? I'd be in the middle of negotiating with suppliers, and Jonah would burst in with that look. You know the one. The God just spoke to me look. Eliza, cancel my appointments. The Lord has work for me. And off he'd go, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. I learned to manage our finances, our household, and our social life pretty much on my own, which, honestly, I was better at anyway. But this time was different. This time, Jonah didn't just get a divine appointment. He got a divine assignment that he absolutely refused to take. It started like any other morning. I was sorting through new silk shipments when Jonah walked in looking pale. Eliza, he said, sitting down heavily, God wants me to go to Nineveh. I looked up from my fabrics. Nineveh? That's a long journey. But okay, when do you leave? I'm not going. I blinked. I'm sorry, what? I'm not going to Nineveh. I'm going to Tarshish instead. Let me get this straight. God says go east to Nineveh, and your brilliant plan is to go west to Tarshish? Jonah, you realize God has a better GPS than you, right? Eliza, you don't understand. Nineveh is full of wicked people. They deserve God's judgment, not his mercy. How far do you think you can run from the one who owns the earth? I can try, he said stubbornly. I put down my measuring tape. This required my full attention. Jonah, darling, you're planning to hide from the God who made hiding places. How's that working out in your head? He crossed his arms. The universal husband signal for, I've made my mind and logic won't change it. So I tried a different approach. Numbers, facts, business sense. I calculated the cost of your Tarshish trip versus just going to Nineveh. The math wasn't adding up. Tarshish is literally twice as far from us than Nineveh. I don't care about the cost, he retorted stubbornly. Well, I do. I manage our finances, remember? Ladies, how many of you have given your husband directions and watched him ignore them completely? I've been married to Jonah for 7 years, and the one thing I've learned is when God speaks, you listen. When your wife speaks, you also listen. But when God and your wife are saying the same thing, that's not a suggestion, husband dear. That's a survival strategy. But Jonah just shook his head. Fine, I said, throwing my hands up. Run if you want, but I'm not packing your bags so I don't partake in your guilt. And I'm definitely not explaining to the neighbors why my prophet husband is hiding from the Almighty. The next morning, Jonah was gone. He'd taken our neighbor's old donkey, you know, the one that always looked like it was taking its last trip. Perfect transportation for a man making the worst decision of his life. And then began the longest 3 weeks of my marriage. The questions started immediately. Eliza, where's Jonah? We haven't seen him at the market. Oh, he's traveling for work. Profit business, you know. When will he be back? Soon, I'd say, forcing a smile. Very soon. Inside, I was dying, not just from worry, but from anger. But if I thought the direct questions were bad, the whispered conversations were worse. You know how it is with neighbors. They think stone walls make them invisible, but voices carry, especially when you're straining fabric in the courtyard and they're discussing your life over the fence. Did you see Jonah leave the other morning? He looked upset about something. Well, Miriam, prophets are always upset about something. Comes with the territory. But this seemed different, Sarah. He was muttering to himself, something about not going somewhere God wanted him to go. My blood ran cold. They'd overheard our argument. Not going? A prophet refusing God? That's not good, Miriam. Do you think that's why he's been gone so long? Divine discipline? Poor Eliza. Can you imagine being married to a man who argues with the Almighty? I wanted to march over there and tell them that their own husbands couldn't find their way to the market without getting lost, but I had fabric to finish and a reputation to maintain. But it got worse. By the second week, they weren't even trying to be subtle. "Good morning, Eliza," called out Judith from across the street. "Still no word from Jonah?" "I'm fine," I replied, hanging out wet cloth with perhaps more force than necessary. "Oh, I'm sure he is, dear. It's just, well, Benjamin saw him at the port in Joppa. Isn't that strange? I thought prophets usually went east, not west." My hands froze on the fabric. Benjamin was a spice merchant who traveled the coastal routes. If he saw Jonah in Joppa, must have been someone else. "I'm sure you're right. Though Benjamin was quite certain, said he looked distressed, kept looking over his shoulder like someone was chasing him." After she left, I sank onto my stool. They knew. They all knew something was wrong, and they were enjoying every minute of it. The gossip mill was in full swing by week 3. "I heard Jonah took that old donkey without asking proper permission," whispered Rebecca to her daughter, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Well, desperate men do desperate things," her daughter replied. "Maybe he owed money to the wrong people. Or maybe," Rebecca's voice dropped to what she thought was probably a whisper, "maybe Eliza finally told him what she really thought about his prophesying schedule. You know how she is about her business." How I am about my business? I run a successful enterprise while my husband goes around the countryside speaking for God, and somehow I'm the problem? But the comment that nearly broke my composure came from Esther, the baker's wife. "Mark my words," she announced to anyone within hearing distance. "When a man runs from God, it never ends well for the family. Poor Eliza might find herself a widow before this is over." A widow. The word hit me like a physical blow. What if she was right? What if Jonah's rebellion cost him his life? What if I never saw him again because he was too stubborn to listen to God or to me? That night I laid awake staring at the ceiling, their words echoing in my mind. The worst part wasn't the gossip. It was that some of their concerns echoed my own fears. I found myself avoiding the market, taking back routes to avoid the cluster of women who always seemed to have nothing better to do than speculate about other people's marriages. But in a small community, there's only so much hiding you can do. "Eliza," Hannah cornered me at the well one morning, "I've been so worried about you, dear. How are you holding up?" Her voice dripped with false sympathy, the kind that really meant, I want all the details so I have something interesting to talk about. "I'm fine, Hannah. Thank you for asking." "Oh, but you must be so concerned. I mean, when a prophet goes missing, well, that usually means God is dealing with something serious. Jonah isn't missing. He's traveling." "Of course, dear, of course." She patted my arm condescendingly. "But if you need anything, someone to talk to, help with the business, you know we're all here for you." The help she was offering felt more like circling vultures than genuine support. I spent those 3 weeks managing everything alone. The business, the household, the endless questions from concerned neighbors, and now the added burden of protecting my husband's reputation while he was off making the worst decisions of his life.
Should I cook his favorite meal for when he returns or prepare divorce papers? And honestly, part of me was furious at him for leaving me to deal with all this alone. Not just the practical things, but the social humiliation, the whispered conversations, the pitying looks, the speculation about our marriage, our finances, our faith. I found myself praying more than I ever had. God, please keep my stubborn husband safe. Please ignore his stubbornness. Oh, God, you created him, so I guess you know how to handle that part of him.
And please, when you're done teaching him his lesson, could you also remind him that his wife is always right? And maybe help me deal with these neighbors without losing my temper completely? I spent 3 weeks practicing my "I told you so" speech. Turns out, a fish beat me to it. But honestly, beneath all my anger was pure terror. What if something happened to him? What if running from God cost him everything? What if he never came home? What if Esther's grim prediction came true? I was making myself sick with worry, and the constant scrutiny from the neighborhood wasn't helping. I was arranging new fabric displays when I heard it, the familiar sound of our neighbor's donkey outside. But something was wrong. The footsteps approaching my shop were different, slower, heavier. Then he appeared in my doorway. "You look terrible, and you're 3 weeks late. This better be good." And he did look terrible. His clothes were clean, but somehow weathered. His hair was different. His whole posture was different. "Before you start, let me guess. It's not what it looks like." "Eliza," he said quietly, "I need to tell you what happened." The humility in his voice stopped my sarcasm cold. This wasn't the stubborn man who'd left 3 weeks ago. "Sit down," I said, suddenly concerned. "Are you hurt? Are you sick?" "No. Well, not anymore." He ran his hands through his hair. "Eliza, I need you to listen to the whole story before you say anything, because you're not going to believe it." So he told me. Everything. How he'd ridden that old donkey all the way to Joppa, how he'd found a ship heading to Tarshish and paid an enormous fare. Money we couldn't afford, by the way. "I went to the lowest part of the ship to sleep," he said. "I was so satisfied with myself. I thought I'd escaped." He described falling into the deepest sleep of his life, dreaming sweet dreams of freedom from God's assignment, until the captain woke him up. "The storm hit while I was sleeping," Jonah continued. "By the time they found me, they'd already thrown half the cargo overboard just to stay afloat." I'm watching his face as he tells me this impossible story, and I see something I've never seen before. Humility. My stubborn, headstrong husband looks broken and somehow renewed. He said, "They cast lots to see who was causing the storm. The lot fell on me." "Of course it did," I murmured. "I told them who I was, that I was running from the God who made the sea and the dry land. Eliza, I've never seen men so terrified." He's describing the darkness, the fear, their desperation. I can see him reliving every terrifying moment. This isn't the voice of someone making things up. This is trauma. This is truth. "I told them to throw me into the sea, that it would calm down because of me." "Jonah, you told them to do what?" "They didn't want to. They rowed harder, trying to get to land. But the storm just got worse." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Finally, they prayed to God not to hold them accountable for my death, and they threw me overboard." Every logical part of me wants to say, that's impossible. But every loving part of me sees the change in his eyes. Something happened to my husband out there. Something big. "The sea calmed instantly," he continued. "And that's when I saw it. This massive fish coming straight for me.
My eyes widened. It swallowed me whole, Eliza. I was inside that fish for 3 days. My eyes widened a lot, if that were even possible, and I just blurted out, "Come on, Jonah, stop. Even our neighbor's little boy Lemuel, with his wild imagination, wouldn't be able to come up with this kind of tale." But he looked dead serious and still in shock as he held up his hands, ignored my cynical laugh, and continued. At this point, I could see he needed to share to get this out. Swallowed by a fish, survived inside its belly for 3 days. 3 days in darkness? He needed to bring it into the light. How did he breathe? How is he even alive and standing here in front of me? Is he alive, or is it his ghost? When he describes praying in that fish belly, his voice breaks. I've never heard my husband's voice break before. He just wasn't the type. Whatever happened out there, it changed him. I prayed like I'd never prayed before, Eliza. I made promises to God. I repented of my stubbornness, my pride, my disobedience. He told me about the seaweed wrapped around his head, the crushing pressure, the smell, the absolute darkness. And then, on the 3rd day, the fish vomited me up, right onto dry land. Where? I asked, though I somehow already knew. Nineveh, the very city I was running from. I was in shock, but the irony wasn't lost on me that my dear husband's race from God ended up with getting a free ride, albeit in the belly of a fish, to Nineveh. If it wasn't so incredulous, scary, and sad, I would have been rolling on the floor in laughter. Men will literally get swallowed by sea creatures before admitting their wives were right. He said, I bathed in the sea several times to get the stench of the fish gut off me. My wet clothes dried right on my body as I walked into the city. And Eliza, I preached like my life depended on it. He described the Ninevites' reaction, how they believed immediately, to his utter shock and anger, how the king himself declared a fast and commanded everyone to repent, even the animals. I was so angry at their repentance, angry that God forgave them. That's exactly what I was afraid would happen. He told me about the plant that grew up overnight to give him shade, how a worm destroyed it the next day, how God used it to teach him about compassion. I finally understood. God's mercy isn't just for Israel. It's for everyone who turns to him. When he finished, we sat in silence for a long moment. A fish? Really? Not a boat delay, not robbers, not getting lost. A fish? Jonah, I said carefully, I love you, but there's a lot going through my mind right now. Our neighbors' kids tell better stories. Do you literally have any evidence to show me? I asked, stunned and still in some sort of disbelief. I've heard every excuse from customers who can't pay their bills. A fish swallowed me is definitely a new one. Look, maybe you just fell off the boat and some fishermen found you. Jonah, I know you don't drink alcohol, so I can't even say you'd been drinking. Did you hit your head? Because this sounds like head injury talk. But even as I said these things, I was studying his face. In my line of work, you learn to spot a lie pretty quickly. I was 29, but having been selling fabrics with my parents since I was 8, I've had experience dealing with human beings that goes well beyond my years because people lie a lot to get fabrics for free or to not pay when we gave them on credit. This wasn't a lie, but it was also an impossibility. But then he started describing Nineveh in detail. Fabric patterns I'd only heard about from traders that traveled to distant lands. Trade routes I'd never mentioned to him. Customs and practices he shouldn't know. He pulled off his sandals. Sure enough, the peculiar and renowned red earth from Nineveh's soil were stuck to the grooves of his sandal. Earth that shouldn't be there if he'd only been to Joppa and back. The people there, he said, they were so different from what I expected. Not monsters, just people. Lost people who needed hope. His whole personality had changed. The man who'd left was stubborn, prideful, angry. The man sitting across from me was humble, compassionate, broken open in the best possible way. But I still needed more proof. That's when Rachel, a traveling fabric merchant, arrived at my shop as though on cue. "Elisa," she called excitedly, "you'll never believe what I heard and then saw in Nineveh." My heart stopped. "The entire city has turned to worship your God. There was this wild-looking preacher, appeared out of nowhere, they said. Someone said they saw him coming up from the shore, but boats don't berth at that part of the shore, so nobody's sure about where he came from. Like he came from the sea itself. He preached with such power that even the king believed." She looked at Jonah, who had gone very pale. "He looked a bit like your husband, actually."
Same beard, same intensity. But that's impossible, right? Your Jonah's been here the whole time, right? That was the moment. The clincher. A traveling merchant confirming the impossible story. I looked at my husband. Really looked at him. "It's all true, isn't it?" He nodded. "That's what I've been telling you, my dear." "Every impossible, ridiculous, fish gut word of it?" I said. Another nod. I started laughing. Not mocking laughter, wonder laughter. My husband got swallowed by a fish because he wouldn't listen to his God or his wife? That about sums it up, Jonah said sheepishly. He then went to have what I believe to be the longest bath a man ever had, as though to wash every remaining stench of the fish from his body. The amount of scented oils he used still cracks me up till today. That night, we held each other and talked until dawn. I told him about the gossips, and we had a good laugh. I learned something important about love and stubbornness, about letting people face the consequences of their choices even when you love them desperately. When he wanted to run away, I could have nagged more, I could have hidden his traveling supplies, I could have physically blocked the door and prevented him from running from his maker. But sometimes love means stepping back. Sometimes it means watching someone you love make terrible decisions and trusting that God is bigger than their mistakes. In business, when you ignore market signals, you lose money. When prophets ignore God's signals, they lose, well, everything. I learned that sometimes the best investment advice is just do what God says the first time. But here's what struck me most. God didn't give up on Jonah. Even when Jonah ran in the opposite direction, God had a plan to bring him back. The fish wasn't punishment, it was rescue. It was mercy in the most impossible form. What do you do when the person you love most makes the worst possible decision? I've thought about this a lot. How do you balance supporting your spouse with speaking truth? Every marriage faces this. Not the fish swallowing part, that's pretty unique to us, but the part where someone you love is heading for disaster and won't listen to reason. When has stubbornness cost you or your loved ones more than pride was worth? I think about all the times I've ignored good advice, all the times I've thought I knew better than God, better than wise counsel, better than the obvious signs all around me. We all run from things we should face. We all try to take shortcuts around God's plans. We all think we can outsmart the one who made us. Here's what I learned. Sometimes God uses circumstances to teach lessons that wives can't. Sometimes it takes a fish to do what a woman's wisdom couldn't. Jonah learned to obey God.
I learned that sometimes love means letting people face the consequences of their choices. And yes, I still bring up the fish story whenever he doesn't listen to me. Yep, as his wife, it's my job. The fish story sounds crazy. Until you realize God will use whatever it takes to get our attention. Sometimes that's a loving wife. Sometimes that's a sea monster. But he'll always make a way. And his way changed my husband and a nation dramatically. God's mercy doesn't give up. His plans don't fail. And his love is bigger than our biggest mistakes. Even when we run in the opposite direction, he's already preparing the path back home. I'm curious, have you ever ignored advice that could have saved you a lot of trouble? Maybe from a spouse, a friend, or even that quiet voice in your heart that sounds a lot like God. Drop a comment and tell me about a time when stubbornness cost you more than it was worth. Trust me, after the fish story, nothing will sound too crazy. If this gave you a new perspective on Jonah's story, or on what it's like to love someone who makes terrible decisions, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want to hear more untold stories from the people behind the Bible heroes, because every famous story has another side, and I'm here to tell it. Next, I'll be sharing the story of another remarkable woman from her husband's point of view, a woman whose husband had to watch her lead an army into battle while he stayed home with the household. The story of Deborah, the judge and prophetess, told by the man who loved and married her, Lapidot. But until then, remember, God's plans are bigger than our mistakes. His love is deeper than our rebellion, and sometimes the most impossible stories turn out to be the most true. Even the fish ones.